There is a number I want you to hold before we go any further. Not a theory, not a claim, just a number, 1820. That is the year the official record says Antarctica was first sighted by human eyes, 1820. And for most of my life I accepted that without question. It is the kind of date that gets absorbed in school. The way all dates get absorbed passively, without friction, filed away as settled. But then I started looking at the cartographic record, not the popular version of it, the actual archive, and the number stopped feeling settled. It started feeling like a door. The door I want to walk you through today is not about conspiracy. I want to be precise about that from the beginning, because the subject of Antarctica attracts a particular kind of content that trades in invented details, in unnamed sources, in photographs that prove nothing and are presented as if they prove everything. I am not doing that. Every claim I make in this video is sourced. Every document I reference exists and can be found. What I am doing is placing documented facts in sequence and asking why that sequence has never been treated as a serious question by the institutions that should be asking it. Start with the maps. Not because the maps are supernatural, because the maps are real and the maps are strange, and the strangeness has a very specific character that the standard explanation does not fully account for. The Peril map was drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Peril. It survives. It is held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. You can look at it. Peril himself wrote in the margins of the map that he compiled it from approximately 20 source documents, some of which he described as very old, dating from the time of Alexander the Great. The map shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a landmass at the bottom of the frame that has generated serious academic argument for nearly a century that landmass sits where Antarctica sits. It has a coastline, not a vague blob, a coastline with bays, peninsulas, and what appear to be river mouths. In 1960, a cartographer at the United States Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer, wrote a letter to Professor Charles Hapgood at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Ohlmeyer's assessment was direct. He wrote that the geographical details shown in the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. That letter exists. It is cited in Hapgood's 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, which is a real book, published by a real academic press and which prompted genuine scholarly debate, not fringe internet speculation, genuine debate in peer-reviewed geography journals about how a map drawn in 1513 could show features of a coastline that were not confirmed by modern science until seismic surveys conducted in the late 1950s. The standard academic response has been that the similarity is coincidental, that Peril was working from incomplete and distorted source material, and that the apparent accuracy is a product of selective comparison. That response is defensible. What it is not is complete, because the Peril map is not alone. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows a continent centered on the South Pole with proportions that are, to use the word carefully, remarkable. Rivers flow from interior mountain ranges toward a coastline that is not covered in ice. The Bosch map of 1739, drawn by Philippe Bosch, who held the title of premier geographer to the King of France, depicts Antarctica as two distinct landmasses separated by a central waterway. That detail, the subglacial separation of the Antarctic continent into two major landmasses divided by a channel, was not confirmed by modern science until the International Geophysical Year of 1958, when ground-penetrating surveys revealed it, that beneath the ice sheet, Antarctica is indeed composed of two major landmasses, with a subglacial trench running between them. Bosch drew that in 1739, 219 years before the technology existed to verify it. The official explanation for all of these maps is that they represent speculative cartography, philosophical geography, the ancient Greek hypothesis that a large southern landmass must exist to counterbalance the northern continents, rendered as geographical detail rather than admitted as hypothesis. That explanation handles some of the evidence. It does not handle the river systems. It does not handle the Bosch subglacial channel. Philosophical speculation does not produce accurate subglacial topography. Observation does. And if the observation was made, the question becomes when and by whom. That question has never received a serious institutional answer. That absence is the first thing in this story that deserves more attention. Now hold the maps and add the expeditions, because the timing of what happens next is something I have spent a long time trying to explain through ordinary historical logic, and I keep arriving at the same place. In 1838, the United States Navy dispatched what became known as the United States Exploring Expedition, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, 6 ships, 246 men, a mission to chart the Southern Ocean and establish the continental Dimensions of whatever lay at the pole. Wilkes mapped approximately 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1842 with charts, specimens, and a report. That was disputed almost immediately, not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete in specific and recurring ways. His officers filed their own accounts separately, and researchers who have compared those accounts to the official published record have noted divergences that cluster around a particular category of observation, the geological descriptions, not the temperatures, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The descriptions of what the exposed rock looked like where wind had scoured the ice away. Those descriptions in the private accounts are more detailed, more specific, and in several cases measurably different from what appeared in the official report. Wilkes was court-martialed upon his return, not once, multiple times over the following years, on charges that ranged from illegal punishment of crew to conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most counts, but he spent the remainder of his career in administrative obscurity. His Antarctic findings perpetually overshadowed by procedural controversy. That is the documented record. I am not adding anything to it. I am asking you to look at it clearly. In the same window, 1837 to 1840, the French sent Jules Dumont d'Urville south. He charted what he named land and returned. He is remembered. He is celebrated. His name is on that section of the Antarctic coastline to this day. James Clark Ross sailed for Britain in the same period. He reached what is now called the Ross Ice Shelf, described it as a wall of ice extending for hundreds of miles, and charted Victorial and reaching as far south as 78 degrees 10 minutes in January of 1842. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint. 3 nations, no shared communication, all producing records in which descriptions of the coastal geology are handled with a consistency of caution that does not appear in any other category of observation across all 3 expeditions. That consistency is not something the standard account explains. It is something the standard account does not discuss. After Ross returned in 1843, something happened that the standard history of Antarctic exploration treats as unremarkable, but which I find genuinely difficult to set aside. Interest collapsed. The 3 most powerful naval nations on Earth, nations that had just spent years and enormous resources sending expeditions to the most remote place on the planet, simultaneously stopped. No major nation sent another Antarctic expedition for nearly 50 years. Historians call this the age of averted interest. That phrase comes from a serious historian, H. A. Mill, writing in the early 20th century, not from a conspiracy website. From a professional historian who noticed the same gap and named it. The explanation that typically accompanies it, that Ross himself discouraged further exploration, that the disastrous Franklin expedition in the Arctic dampened polar enthusiasm generally, that there were no obvious commercial incentives, these explanations are plausible. Individually, together, for all 3 nations simultaneously. For 50 years they are insufficient. Nations do not abandon continents because one admiral's report is discouraging. Nations abandon continents when something about the return on further investigation no longer seems worth the cost. What that cost might have been is not recorded. The silence is the record. I want to be careful here about the difference between what the evidence shows and what it suggests. The evidence shows maps with documented accuracy that exceeds what the cartographers could have produced from contemporary knowledge alone. The evidence shows 3 separate naval expeditions converging on the same location in the same decade, filing official reports that diverge from private accounts in the same specific category. The evidence shows a 50-year withdrawal of institutional interest followed by a sudden return. What the evidence suggests is a question, not an answer. The question is this: what is the relationship between what those early expeditions found and the decisions that followed? I do not know the answer. I am not going to pretend I do. What I know is that the question has not been seriously asked by the institutions that have the resources to investigate it. Let me tell you about what we know with precision about the physical reality of Antarctica beneath the ice. Because this is not speculation. This is the result of decades of scientific work, of drilling programs and seismic surveys and satellite imaging, and what it reveals is genuinely extraordinary, independent of any historical mystery. Antarctica is not uniformly frozen. It contains approximately 379 known subglacial lakes, the largest of them, Lake Vostok, which sits beneath roughly 4 kilometers of ice, is approximately the size of Lake Ontario and contains liquid water that has been isolated from the surface for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. The lake was confirmed in the 1990s using ice-penetrating radar, and its existence had been theorized since the 1970s based on anomalies in the ice sheet. There is a river system beneath the ice, not one river, a network. The subglacial geology is varied in ways that matter. Parts of West Antarctica sit below sea level. Parts of the transantarctic mountains reach heights comparable to the Alps. The continent beneath the ice is a landscape of considerable complexity, with basins and ranges and drainage systems that would have functioned as a recognizable geography if you had been standing on it when it was not covered in ice. The question of when it was not covered in ice is where the science becomes genuinely contested. The Standard Model says Antarctic glaciation began approximately 34 million years ago, when the Drake Passage opened and allowed the Antarctic circumpolar current to isolate the continent thermally. The ice cores taken from drilling sites like Vostok and Dome Sea support a picture of continuous glaciation extending back hundreds of thousands of years at minimum. That is serious science conducted by serious researchers, and I am not dismissing it. But here is the tension that the Bosch map and the Orontius-Phineas map create. And it is a tension that the mainstream account has not resolved. Those maps depict specific coastal geography, specific internal drainage features, specific topographic relationships that correspond to the subglacial terrain confirmed by 20th century surveys. If Antarctica has been continuously glaciated for 34 million years, those features would have been completely inaccessible to any human observer. The only way a human cartographer could have depicted them is if there was a period of reduced glaciation. In historical time during which the coastline and the major drainage features were accessible to observation, there is evidence, contested but real, that Antarctic glaciation has not been perfectly stable across the Holocene. Core samples from marine sediments around the Antarctic coast show periods of reduced ice extent. Researchers, including James Kennett and David Harwood, have published peer-reviewed work suggesting that certain sections of the West Antarctic ice sheet may have been substantially reduced during the mid-Holocene warm period, roughly 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. Those papers exist. They are not fringe publications. They appeared in journals including Nature and Quaternary Science reviews. The argument is ongoing. What I want you to take from it is not a conclusion but a posture. The question of whether Antarctica's coastline was accessible to human observation at any point in the Holocene is an open scientific question, not a settled one. And the maps suggest that the answer might matter more than the mainstream account has acknowledged. Now the 20th century, because whatever you make of the cartographic evidence and the early expeditions, what happens after 1945 is documented with a specificity that removes it entirely from the realm of interpretation. In August of 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump. The scale of this operation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to read the numbers without feeling them. 4,700 men, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, and a submarine, 33 aircraft. It was the largest military expedition ever sent to Antarctica. The stated objectives were to train personnel in polar conditions, test cold weather equipment, and conduct aerial photography for mapping purposes. The operation was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It was terminated in late February of 1947, roughly 3 months after it began, well ahead of schedule, with no detailed public explanation offered for the early withdrawal. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, who commanded the aerial scientific component, gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, in March of 1947, in which he described Antarctica as a strategic area and expressed the view that in the event of a new war, the United States might face threats from directions involving the poles. The interview is real, it is archived, it is cited in serious historical accounts of the early Cold War period. What it does not explain is why an operation of that scale was terminated 3 months early. The documentation that exists on that specific question is thinner than institutional records of operations this size normally are. 12 years later, in 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in Washington. The treaty established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, prohibited military operations, and banned weapons testing. It froze all territorial claims and required every station to be open to inspection by any signatory nation. Today, the treaty has 54 signatories. No nation has withdrawn. It's remarkably durable and comprehensive. It covers the one landmass on Earth that has never supported a permanent human population. It is more restrictive, more uniformly enforced, and more consistently maintained than any other treaty. The continent it governs is twice the size of Australia. Ordinary citizens cannot go there without institutional authorization and logistical support. I am not saying the treaty is nefarious. Its purposes for peaceful science and protecting a unique environment are legitimate. But its practical effect is that the continent with anomalous cartographic evidence is where independent investigation is structurally impossible. The coincidence of that restriction with the specific nature of what remains unexplained raises a question about institutional behavior. When anomalies appear in other domains, institutions investigate them. When a medical finding doesn't fit, journals publish competing analyses. When an archaeological site produces artifacts that predate the standard timeline, there is debate and scientific inquiry. The Peril, Orontius Phineas, and Bosch maps have been known to scholars for decades. Their specific accuracy of subglacial detail has been acknowledged in peer-reviewed literature. Hapgood's work was serious enough that Albert Einstein wrote a foreword to his earlier book. Yet serious institutional investigation into these maps, to account for their accuracy, has not happened. There is no funded research program attempting to answer how those maps came to contain that information. There is dismissal, occasional academic acknowledgement, and then silence. The silence is not nothing. It is a shape, a question someone has decided does not need to be answered. The subglacial topography of Antarctica is still being mapped. The Bed-McKean Antarctica project in 2019 produced the highest resolution map of the continent beneath the ice. It revealed features previous surveys had missed entirely: deep troughs, unexpected ridges, and drainage basins. These influence ice sheet stability, relevant to sea level projections for the next century. The science is ongoing. The continent is still, in meaningful ways, unknown. In the gap between what those 16th and 18th century maps show and what 20th century surveys confirm, there is a question. It has been sitting in the archive for decades without an institutional home. Not because the question is unreasonable, but because it is uncomfortable. Answering it properly would require acknowledging a chapter in geographic knowledge that the standard account does not accommodate. I am not claiming Antarctica contains a lost civilization, nor that the treaty is hiding something specific. I am not claiming that Operation Highjump found anything in particular. What I am claiming is this: the cartographic record contains documented, verified, peer-acknowledged evidence of geographic knowledge that should not have existed. The early exploration record contains documented, verified evidence that official reports diverged from private accounts. The institutional record contains evidence of a 50-year withdrawal of interest, followed by massive military investment, followed by the most comprehensive international governance agreement ever applied to any single geographic region. Each of these facts has an explanation. The maps are coincidence or distortion. The divergent accounts are normal variation. The withdrawal was practical. High jump was training. The treaty is diplomacy. I have read those explanations. Some are convincing. None, taken together, fully accounts for why the sequence is so consistent, so specific, and so uniform across institutions and nations that had no apparent reason to coordinate their response. The maps are still in the archives. The subglacial terrain they describe is still under the ice exactly where they said it would be, and the question of how they knew is still, in the most precise and literal sense of the word, unanswered. Not debated into resolution, not explained away, unanswered. That is the only thing I am certain of. The question exists. It has not been closed, and I think it deserves to be asked louder than it has been. The ice remembers what the record does not say, and somewhere under 2 miles of frozen silence the coastline those cartographers drew is still exactly where they placed it. Nobody has yet asked the right question at the right door, but the door is there, and it has been there for 500 years. Here is something that does not appear in most discussions of Antarctic history, and I think it should. The question of what the continent looked like before the ice is not merely a cartographic puzzle. It is a climate science question with direct relevance to the present. The West Antarctic ice sheet, which is the portion of the continent that sits on bedrock below sea level, is considered potentially unstable. The Bed-McKean project confirmed that the bedrock geometry beneath the ice creates conditions for marine ice sheet instability, in which warming ocean water can reach the base of the ice sheet from below and accelerate melting in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The current scientific consensus is that the West Antarctic ice sheet could contribute between 1 and 3 meters of global sea level rise under high warming scenarios by the end of this century. That is not a fringe estimate. It's the range produced by models the IPCC draws on in its assessment reports. What this means for the historical question is not straightforward, but it is worth thinking about carefully. If the West Antarctic ice sheet has been unstable before, if it retreated significantly during the mid-Holocene warm period, as some peer-reviewed research suggests, the question of whether its coastline was accessible to human observation in historical time is not an abstract cartographic puzzle. It connects to the same dynamics climate scientists are studying for practical reasons. The geology the Bosch map apparently knew about in 1739 is the same geology determining if coastal cities around the world face catastrophic flooding in the next 100 years. That connection between the historical mystery and the present scientific problem has not been made explicitly in either the historical or the scientific literature. I think that is strange. I think it's the kind of connection a well-functioning research institution would want to investigate. The absence of that investigation is itself a data point. I also want to address what it would mean, practically and scientifically, to take the cartographic evidence seriously. Not to accept it uncritically, to take it seriously. Taking it seriously means asking if the source maps Peril described, the documents he compiled from, are traceable. It would mean systematic comparison of all pre-1820 maps showing southern landmasses against high-resolution bed-Makin topography, not the selective comparison Hapgood conducted in the 1960s with cruder data available then, but a rigorous, comprehensive, statistically analyzed comparison using the best available subglacial data. It would mean examining mid-Holocene West Antarctic deglaciation, not just for current ice sheet dynamics, but for its implications for the history of geographic knowledge. None of this is impossible. None of it is even particularly expensive relative to what research institutions routinely fund. The reason it has not happened is not that the questions are unanswerable. It is that the questions sit in an uncomfortable space between disciplines. Cartographic historians are not glaciologists. Glaciologists are not historians of exploration. Antarctic scientists work within a framework that takes 1820 as the baseline for human engagement with the continent, and does not have obvious institutional reasons to question that baseline. The questions fall through the gaps between fields. That is how serious anomalies stay unresolved for decades. Not because anyone decided they should stay unresolved, because the structure of academic institutions does not reward work that crosses disciplinary lines to ask questions that make everyone at the table slightly uncomfortable. There is one more thread I want to pull before I close, and it involves the specific geography of where the early expeditions went and what they described when they got there. The coastal sections of Antarctica that Ross, Wilkes, and D'Urville explored in the 1840s are not uniformly covered in ice. They contain exposed rock formations, cliff faces scoured by wind, geological features accessible to observation without any drilling or surveying technology. Early expedition members described these features extensively. The journals, the raw logs, the private letters, many of which have been inaccessible archives for decades, contain a consistent thread of geological description that has never been systematically analyzed against what modern surveys of the same locations show. This is not a difficult research project. It would require a scholar with access to the archival record and familiarity with current Antarctic geological maps. The comparison of what 19th century observers described in the exposed nunataks and coastal rock faces with what high-resolution modern surveys show about the same formations could either confirm that the early descriptions are ordinary and unremarkable, which is the assumption the mainstream account rests on, or it could reveal that some of what they described is strange in ways that deserve further attention, that research has not been done. I have looked for it and it does not exist in any form that I can find in published literature. An absence of research is not evidence that the research would find something significant, but in a case where the cost of the research is low and the potential value of the finding is high, the absence of the research is something that deserves to be noted. What would it cost to compare 19th century geological descriptions of Antarctic coastal formations to modern survey data of the same locations? Not much. What might it reveal? Potentially nothing. Potentially something that changes how we read the historical record of Antarctic exploration. The fact that nobody has done it, given that the archival material is accessible and the modern survey data exists, is one of the quieter anomalies in this story, and the quieter anomalies, I have come to believe, are often the most telling ones. The maps are in Istanbul and in Paris and in the Library of Congress. The expedition logs are in the National Archives and in the British Library and in repositories across France and Norway and Chile. The subglacial terrain is mapped at higher resolution than ever before. The tools to compare all of these things exist. What does not exist is the institutional will to ask the question that putting them all in the same room would force you to ask. I do not think that absence is the result of a decision made in any particular room by any particular group of people. I think it is the result of the ordinary tendency of institutions to avoid questions that threaten the coherence of the framework those institutions are built around. The framework of Antarctic history is built around 1820. Everything before that date is prologue. Everything after it is the story. And the prologue contains things that the story, as currently told, cannot accommodate: the maps, the 50-year silence, the scale of high jump against the thinness of its documentation, the 54 nations agreeing about the one continent that, by the official account, contains nothing worth disagreeing about. These things are all in the record. The record is available. The question is whether you trust the framework more than you trust the evidence that does not fit inside it. I have come to trust the evidence. I have come to believe that the evidence is pointing somewhere and that the place it is pointing has not yet been reached by anyone with the tools and the institutional standing to arrive there and say clearly what they find. That destination may turn out to be ordinary. The answer at the end of all this may be that the maps were lucky guesses and the silence was practical and the treaty is exactly what it says it is. I would accept that answer if it came from genuine investigation. What I cannot accept is the absence of the investigation itself. The door is there. It has been there for 500 years. Nobody has walked through it with the right key. I think it is time someone tried.